Don't let rampant politics and clusterfuckery ruin all your projects and your sanity. Smooth ugly penny lines and make it all make sense. Get experience by osmosis here on Corporate Underpants.
Oh my God, you guys. It's here. Corporate Underpants with Jared Spool. I am so excited. Welcome to Corporate Underpants, the live recording of what will also be launched as a recorded podcast that you can listen to in audio or watch in video or whatever it is that floats your boat. I'm Tamara Adlin. I'm your host. I'm very excited to have launched Corporate Underpants, a long-time idea and passion project of mine. And Corporate Underpants is all about the real things that get in the way of us launching great products, which have very little to do with the things that we focus much of our time on. Instead of focusing on process and on little things in the double diamond or whatever, we can and should be, as we get more and more senior, we should be focusing on managing up. We should be focusing on getting better at politics. We should be focusing on stakeholder alignment. Corporate Underpants is what happens when you don't have those things in place and you end up launching your org chart or launching a product where things don't make sense for our users or our customers because we've been fighting internally usually even about the wrong things and launching based on those misalignments and miscommunications. Corporate Underpants is the problem. I'm a big believer that learning how to become better at stakeholder alignment is a solution. I have my own way of doing that, which I call Align Before Design, and I'm working on a book on that, and you can go and see more about that on my website. I'll put links here on adlininc.com and sign up to be an early reviewer of that or help me get off my ass to launch that. But in the meantime, we're going to talk more about the problem. And you guys, I am very excited because we have, as my guest today, are you ready? Brace yourselves. The one, the only, Jared fucking Spool. Jared, hi. How the hell are you?
I am fine. I didn't know you knew the middle name my mother gave me.
Okay.
That's how she'd tell me to, Jared fucking Spool, get in here.
Would she really? I would so love to know that was true.
No, my mother was born in the Midwest. I don't think I ever heard her swear.
So she'd be truly appalled that I disrespected you in such an odious manner just now.
Yeah, sure. Oh, Tamara.
Language.
Like,
So Jared, I can introduce
know.
you, but anybody watching this, you know who Jared Spool is. If you don't, then you probably haven't been around in product or maybe you haven't been around in the world of user experience, UX, because pretty much everybody who came up through the ranks of user experience knows who the hell Jared is. But they don't know as much about Jared as I do because they know Jared today. So Jared, you can learn about Jared's ideas in tons and tons of ways. Through massive, wonderful writing, presentations that keep you on the edge of your seat. If you ever see Jared speaking at a conference, you need to go to that main stage above all others because it's super duper fun and funny. But it occurred to me when I was like, Jared's been on lots of podcasts. We are going to talk about some stuff that not everybody knows about you. So I know Jared from way back in the day. We are both older than the 29 years old that we look. I've been 29 for over 20 years, I think.
Yeah, I know. For years, I had no idea how old my mother. For some reason, I'm talking about my mother a lot. I had no idea how old my mother was until I saw her birth date on her tombstone, because that was the only way. She was 29 for most of my life until I turned 40 or 35 or something. And then she became 39. And then she stayed there forever.
And then she died.
And then she passed away. Yeah. And then I learned that she was actually much older than that. That was the first clue I had.
It was a massive shock to you that she was much older.
It was really weird looking down and seeing the grave marker and saying, yeah, I guess I never knew that.
Which, you know what? This is a perfect thing because yes, I never knew that is a big part of why our products don't work well when we launch them.
That is right.
So it was a perfect.
I never knew that. I never knew those people used our product that way.
So when I was coming up in the world of UX, I got my grad degree from University of Washington in the Department of Technical Communication, which it was called then. Now it's Human-Centered Design and Engineering. In 1996, I got my master's degree. And when I was graduating, Jared, you were already a key badass in our field.
My ass was completely bad at that moment.
It was terrible. And how, if people had just discovered you like in the year 2000 or the early 2000s, what would they have discovered? What was your focus back then?
In the 2000s, we've been around since 88. We was User Interface Engineering was the company I founded, which later became Center. I'd been in the field since the late 70s. So I'd been around for a very long time, but we were in the early 2000s, we were focused on the web because that was the frontier. We've always been at the frontier of something.
Wait a second. You said you've been in the field since the 70s. There was no field in the 70s.
I was in technology. I was a software developer
Mhm.
building things for people to use. And in the very early 80s, I started working on what were at the time the first personal computers. Keep in mind that the IBM PC didn't come out until 1983. The Mac came out in 1984. So in 1980, I was working on personal computer technology and trying to figure out what personal computers would be.
Was this before or
working
after
for
all the stuff at Xerox PARC? So you were around
It was at the same time, and it was the Xerox PARC stuff, the Apple Lisa, the Apple II had been out for several years. The II Plus was their first big product, and then the IIe. Radio Shack had a computer called the TRS-80. There were a bunch of other personal computer products that were out there. I was working for a company called Digital Equipment Corporation that had made all of its money on big computers, mini computers and mainframe computers. And we could see the writing on the wall that the technology was getting smaller, smaller, and smaller. And so we could start to put boxes that used to require a closet or a dedicated room to run. We could now put boxes on people's desktops. And the question then become, what do you do with it when you have something on people's desktops? And one of the things that if you weren't around back then, you don't think about is that up until personal computers, if you wanted to physically touch a computer and use it, you had to undergo months of training, and everything was written in manuals, and you had to memorize all these commands. And it was a profession, an occupation to operate a computer. Computer operators were a highly paid profession. And we knew once we saw what was happening in the personal computer space, that job was going away. And so now the question is, how do you make things so that anybody can use them? And nobody knew the answer to that. That had never been done before.
This was
So
before
we
the
had,
mouse. This was before anything that looked like a window. This
yeah,
was a
the
blinking
mouse.
cursor that you had to type something after
Yes.
to have something
Well,
happen.
yeah, mice were just starting to exist. So the Xerox Alpha and then later the Xerox Star had a mouse, and the Lisa had a mouse. And so our machine had a mouse.
My
But
boss, Larry Tesler, you knew of Larry Tesler.
I know Larry.
Yeah, he
Yeah,
was my boss at Amazon. He did the initial user tests on the mouse to figure out how
he
stiff
did.
the cord could be so that it wouldn't pull the mouse out of the way and be too stiff, but not be so soft that the mouse would run over the cord. And he also had
Right.
arguments with the industrial engineers over how many clicks would ever be done on a mouse over the lifetime of the mouse. They wanted to make it so that it would be up to 100,000. It would be good. And he was like, yeah, it's not even close.
I later worked at a company called Symbolics, and they made these workstations, these giant workstations that cost $60,000 a pop or more, only one user for a $60,000 computer. And we had a developer who I was like 3 offices down, and suddenly I'd hear this loud string of expletives,
And it was
and then this thunk against the wall. And then he would calmly walk out of his office, walk down the hall to the supply cabinet, open the supply cabinet, get a new mouse, and then walk back in his office and close his door. This would happen once or twice a week.
okay. So for people listening, you have to understand there was no user experience design. There was no idea of a product professional. There was a bunch of people who knew how to code. It reminds me in my mental model of the crypto kids. It was elitist. It was technical elitism. Either you knew how to use it or you didn't. And then there were these weirdos like Jared saying, wait a second. And
Yeah,
you were saying stuff like, if we're going to put this on the desk, who's sitting at the desk?
exactly. Had this So the CEO of Ford Motor was on the board of my company, and my CEO was on the board of his company. And we were told very early on that our computer would be on the desk of the CEO at Ford. And we were trying to figure out what he would do with it. Why, up until this point, if you wanted to use a computer for something, you called the IT people and they wrote a program and gave you a pile of printouts. And so what would he do with this? And one of the first things I got to work on was one of the first word processors. And that was really interesting because nobody had built a word processor that someone could just walk up and use. Word processing existed as a vocation. You could become a person whose job title was word processor. And your job was to use equipment usually made by either the Wang Corporation or Digital Equipment Corporation. That we had a model called the Deckmate. And this was a dedicated device. And if you wanted to learn how to use it, you had to come to our facilities in Billerica, Massachusetts. And you would take a 1-week course. And during that 1-week course, you'd learn how to load a file, save a file, print a file, and change the ribbon on the printer, because that turned out to be really hard to do. And the second week, which was the advanced course, you could stay for. And in that course, you learned bold and italics, which required that you change the daisy wheel on the printer to do italics, because to change fonts, you had to change wheels.
Didn't the president of Ford or the CEO have a secretary?
So that was the thing, was that we started thinking, no, okay, maybe the secretary would use this thing. Then two guys out of Cambridge, Bob Frankston and my name servers got latency. It'll come to me in a second.
You're such a nerd.
They invented this thing called VisiCalc.
Yep.
And VisiCalc was the spreadsheet. And suddenly that changed the game because people were buying spreadsheets. Dan Brooklyn, that's the other guy's name. I knew it would come. People would buy computers just to get VisiCalc. So this was like the first killer app for personal computers. And this was for spreadsheets. So now we had a sense as to who was going to use it. It'd be people who use spreadsheets and people who use word processing. And so that helped us a lot. And I ended up working on the spreadsheet and the word processor. I also ended up working on email. So I wrote some of the first email clients. We also had a peripheral in our device that would let you do text to voice and voice recording. So I created a sort of personal voicemail system that you could have, and also a text to voice system and a voice to text system. So I accidentally created voicemail, which I didn't mean to do. So I apologize for that. And then one of the other claims to fame that I have, and it amuses my kids to no end, is that if you think of a big keyboard, right? So a standard PC keyboard, you've got your alphanumeric key array, you've got F1 through F12.
Yep.
You've got your numeric keypad. And between the numeric keypad and the alphanumeric, the QWERTY array, there's an inverted T set of arrow keys and 6 buttons that say page up, page down, insert, delete. Yeah, I designed those.
Oh my God, you did not.
Yeah. I didn't do the inverted T.
Lord.
That was Rob Rubin. He did the inverted T. But I got to design the 6 keys above the arrow keys.
Okay, so let me tell you guys listening why I'm bringing this, because we're also going to fast forward. As charming and archaic and sweet, cute and weird as these stories sound, I bet you in 5 years and 10 years, somebody's going to do a podcast and say, back when AI came out, there was this thing called prompt engineering, and people were taking classes to learn how to become prompt engineers. And there were books on prompt engineering, and there were all these different AI things, and you could subscribe to them. All of the stuff that we're working on now, if you fast forward, is going to seem just as wacky and silly and interesting and old. And I just think that perspective is so good for us to have, to remember that the thing that stays constant is people and what they want and need.
Yeah. And there used to be this thing that came out every year, which at the new year, it's like people who were born 20 years ago didn't know about, and they would list all these things. And it's been there all their lives. We're now in a world where it is very possible that you can be an adult and the iPhone has always existed in your life.
Yeah. I got this cute little statue, a Jonathan Adler thing. It's
Yeah.
actually a phone stand. But this is what my phone looked like when I was a teenager. Not one.
Yeah.
No, yeah, there's people who had never had that experience ever. And it's
Yeah. My son was just asking me questions about what it was like to use a rotary phone. And it was,
yeah, there's videos of young people trying to poke in the holes there. Okay, so
yes.
so to keep this on the whole corporate underpants and politics and alignment and getting powerful, as you help to build the whole world of product and UX, this way of thinking that if we find it hard to make our arguments today, imagine how hard it was to make those arguments then. And then as we fast forward, Jared, through the 80s, you had your own company, User Interface Engineering, which sounds technical today, but wasn't then. It was, what do you mean user interface?
Yeah. That was the real sort of thinking behind it, was this idea that we had to think about users. We had to engineer solutions that users would care about. Because up until that point, you basically build things for yourself, right? It's like, how would I want to use this? Because back in the day, you were probably the first user of the thing you built. You built things for yourself to use, and then maybe you let other people use it.
And
But for
you
the most
were the
part,
trained
that was it.
engineer. It's like the crypto bros. They build things for people who already understand all that stuff.
Yeah, to some extent. Yeah, absolutely.
So then in the early 2000s, you at UI, as when you own your own company, your own consulting firm, you constantly have to reinvent and figure out what people are buying and what to sell and how to package pretty much the same set of expertise you've already had, which is fundamentals. You helped create those fundamentals.
Yeah, I mean, we were the first ones to do any research on what made a good website. And we were back in the late 90s, early 2000s. We were basically just going around telling people what we'd learned by watching hundreds and hundreds of people use websites and what worked and what didn't work. And so most of the major navigation standards that we have today came out of that work. The way that people interact on websites today, where the buttons get placed, the fact that you put form fields first and then you put the buttons after versus having the buttons at the top, though Apple does that now. But you didn't used to do that, was because there was this sort of top to bottom, left to right flow that made sense, that you start in the upper left-hand corner, at least for left to right languages. You start in the upper left-hand corner and you work your way, and then the button's at the bottom. It just made sense. Put the button at the top, people are going to hit it before they fill in the information. Then they're going to get an error message, and then they have to figure out why they're getting an error message. Oh, wait, I'm supposed to fill in information and then hit the button. And all of these sort of things that we don't give much thought to because they've just become the way things were, started because we looked at hundreds of websites that didn't do it that way and watched people struggle with them.
So everything, I think this is two important points that I like to bring up. One is that if we in our profession do our job, it looks like we were never needed in the first place. Because I think people listening to this can't imagine that a website would start at the top and go to the bottom. Like these things that we could take as obvious. Jared's one of the guys who had to fight engineers and executives to not fuck that up. Because every time you have technical people or new business people, they want to reinvent everything. And some of the things we take for granted today, this is the person who fought for them, which is why it's so interesting for me to bring you on today and talk about what it is you're doing now. Because as we talk about the whole idea of executive alignment, stakeholder alignment, misalignment being the thing that causes catastrophes in product, you have come to be a driving voice, in my opinion, in the way I see you with Center and the Leaders of Awesomeness stuff that you do, in yelling about the fact that we have to get really good at convincing people of this and having them listen to us.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the basics are that you have to really understand what it is that people need from you. And then you have to position what you're doing in such a way that, and so the trick for any of this is really understanding what does great UX really mean to an organization, to a team, to the users. Understand that and find a way to position things. So that's the obvious direction to go. And the challenge for any of that is really about how do we become relevant and prioritized above all the other things that the organization is freaking out about at any given time.
And just to poke in here for those of you listening, Larry, one of our live attendees, said I had a lot of fights about usability stuff with engineers and marketers in the late 90s and early 2000s, and drew on Jared's wisdom to at least hold my own once in a while.
Yes, Larry and I go way back, so that he's a brilliant UX person, and I think he undersells his own abilities. But yes, that is in fact a lot of what, right?
Who does content insights, I believe is your podcast, Larry. We'll put a link to it.
Yeah. The thing is that people have the right intention. The other day, someone came to me and was like, what do I do? My product manager keeps bringing me designs that they just want me to flesh out. And how do I tell them that's my job? They shouldn't be designing. And I'm like, they have an interest in designing. Why are you pushing them away? Sometimes you might treat it the way you treat a 6-year-old who wants to help you bake cookies. You just, okay, we're going to set you up here with your own dough and your own stuff, and you just play with that. I actually place the cookies on the cookie sheet. But if you've got people who are interested in participating in the design process, I think that's great, because I was in a universe way back when nobody was interested in participating in the design process, and they didn't understand why it had to be a thing. So
Let me pick on that for a minute, though, because I had an episode with Jillian Hudson a couple weeks ago where we talked about UX democratization gone wrong. And you talk about this in some of your talks as well. And I know that you referenced some of Dana Chisnell's work in this too. There's a balance between this idea of democratization and saying that the product person has an interest in design, but still hanging on to the fact that there is a discipline here, and that just because you can draw a wireframe doesn't mean you know how to. Her point was, Jillian's point was, we leave out the part democratization of UX. We leave out the two words with training. What do you think of that statement? You might disagree.
I think that there's a couple things here. One is I'm not a big fan of democratization, but not for the same reason. Almost all the time when people talk about democratization, what they're really talking about is I want to turn over the boring, easy parts to this other group of people so I can go do the more interesting, more difficult parts. And that's not democratization, that's delegation. And that is in itself problematic because this notion that you're no longer going to do the simple usability test, you're going to let somebody else do it. And almost always it's basically using horrible methods that nobody should be using, like unmoderated testing or survey tools or things like that. So I'm not a big fan of that part of the movement of democratization. Here's where I come in. I think that research and design are skills, and they are learned skills. Nobody is born knowing how to do usability tests. I can tell you this because I lived in an age where none of us knew how to do it. We had to invent them. I was in the first usability test lab that ever existed for software. And I sat in on
Where was that?
in Maynard, Massachusetts, on the 5th floor of ML5 in 1982.
What's ML5?
That was the designation of the building called the Mill that was owned by Digital Equipment Corporation. And we were testing the first personal computers. Years later, what's the name of that guy? Oh my damn! I am old. I am forgetting names. It'll come to me. There was one of the first online hiring companies, Monster. That was it, Monster.com, and they had their offices on the same floor. And I went and spoke at an event that they were hosting. Their UX people were hosting this event. And I went to speak at this thing in this lovely little room that was in their offices, this function room. And I was talking about, you do know that the first usability test lab is on this floor in this building. And they're like, no. They were giving tours of their lab, which was very fancy and very nice. And I took them down the hall to what was their break room. And I said, yeah, the lab was right here in an air conditioning closet. We had to, whenever we were running usability tests, we had to shut off the air conditioning for the entire building. And
The entire building. Oh my God.
For the entire building, because it was this giant, massive air conditioner that was the size of this wall. And it made so much noise when it ran. And so we would just turn off the breaker and there'd be no air conditioning in the building while we ran the usability test. People hated us.
Oh, I would imagine. No, also and Joshua L says, Jared, your usability test with Lycos in the late 90s started my career. Many thanks.
Yes, we did such cool tests with Lycos. We would go into the field. So we did some of the first field-based user research that was ever done for software. We went to this giant, what do you call it? I should eat more fish. My grandfather would tell me fish is brain food. Yeah. No, what do you call it? There are booths where people sell all the crap.
Like a market, like a farmer's market?
Yes, it was a giant
yard sale.
flea market. That was it. Brimfield. They have hundreds and hundreds of people. It takes over the whole town in Western Massachusetts. Happens 4 times a year. Cher comes up to shop there. Antiques Fair. That's what it is. Thank you, Josh. And we went out there. We set up a tent. And it was like 100 degrees out, 98 degrees out or something. And we were asking people with ice cold soda and $20 gift certificates to come in and look for whatever they'd look for at the antique fair. We wanted to see them use a search engine to do it. And And we invented a whole new method called interview-based tasks, where you interview people about what they would be doing if they weren't with you. And then you have them do that in front of you. So that's what we did. And we probably conducted usability tests over 3 days with more than 150 people. It was the most number of folks we'd ever done up to that point. And we had to run massive extension cords from the ladies' room that was next door to where we got our tent set up. We bought the cheapest tent we could get, so it was right outside the ladies' room. And we ran extension cords to power the laptops that we'd brought out. We brought out
Actually,
like
that was
30
probably
laptops.
one of the most valuable tents, because where do you park the husband while you're peeing? It should have been
Yeah,
some manly like tool tent or something like that. But instead,
yeah.
okay. All right. So hold on a second. So part of this is me being fascinated. I had a whole series of interviews called UX Pioneers that I took down. I need to put them back up again. And I need to do one with you, which is how you helped start the field. And that's why I've gotten in.
Okay.
But I want to redirect us now, even though I want to continue this, to today and how all of this experience. And then, by the way, people listening, and then in the late 2000s, 2010s, on that, Jared was the guy that you'd spend $20,000 to come in for one day and talk to your team at a giant company, and they would happily pay that and more, I'm sure. Now, now you're doing this thing that is about how do we as product and UX professionals get and keep a seat at the table, which is to me related to where I've come to. I'm sure you got there before me, but if we can't get people talking to each other and working together well, and if we can't get people to listen to us, whining about people not listening to us is completely, totally pointless. And we are way too prone to do that. And when you stop whining, what do you do? And what are your goals? Right? So how did you get to this? How did you get to where you are now, which is, and maybe you should describe it. What is Leaders of Awesomeness?
The Over the years, our function, what we've been trying to do at what first UIE and then Center was always the same, which is we're trying to figure out how to get rid of all the poorly designed things in the world. And as far as I'm concerned, we know how to design things. There shouldn't be anything that's poorly designed, but we still produce things that are poorly designed. So we've always been trying to figure out, why do we keep making this stuff? And at first it was because we didn't know how to do it. So we had to figure out how to do it. And then it was because we knew how to do it, but it wasn't widely distributed information. So we had to figure out how to distribute the information. Now it's part of the basic curriculum of design and all of those things. And so now the issue is that organizations don't know how to lead design. And so that's been the focus for the last decade or so, has been about how do we lead design in organizations. And this came about, there was this big boom in the early 2010s where organizations were building design teams. You had Capital One acquire Adaptive Path because it was cheaper to hire 30 people at a time than it was to recruit and interview 30 individual UX people. So people were just buying agencies because Adaptive Path did not start out to become a bank, but they ended up a bank. And I used to have a sign on my door when we had an office that had the number of days since UIE was founded written out, and it just had 6,221 days without becoming a bank was the number. And we would update it every day.
I haven't thought about Adaptive Path in a while, but yeah, they were enormous.
Yeah. And then McKinsey bought somebody, and Fjord, and then all those agencies got bought. And it was because there was such a growing demand for design and UX that you couldn't find people. And once they started building this stuff, it became clear that if you're going to have these big teams, at one point, Capital One had more than 1,000, like 1,200 UX. Verizon had 600 UX people. And And these big organizations with these huge numbers, it's like, how do you lead that type of effort? How do you start to think about what design is like at a strategic level? And what we quickly realized was that most of the design that we talk about today, most of the UX that we talk about today is 100% tactical. It's all about running usability tests and creating wireframes and handing over Figma files. And it's not about being strategic. It's not about asking, how would a better user experience produce results? An example from the headlines, right? So last week or the week before last, Workday, which is a company that made $7,259,000,000 last year, Workday laid off 1,750 people, of which a bunch of them were UX people. Not all of them. In fact, a very small percentage was UX people, but there were UX people in the layoff. And mostly they're product teams. And by laying off 1,750 people, if you assume that when you add in salary and benefits and equipment and electricity and Figma licenses and all the things that it takes to employ a person, they're going to save $350 million this year. That's how much 17,050 people cost them. And if you ask the question, if they kept those people, how would they have produced more revenue for Workday than $350 million? None of them could tell you. And this is a lack of having design leadership. The inability for us to understand how every designer has to produce more than $200,000 worth of value to the organization every year just to keep their job.
It's always the bottom line. And we get snobbish about that too, as design people or UX people. We get super snobbish about business stuff, and we get on a high horse about every product should be suitable for users and we should be at the center of the room and people should really, but that's okay. And who cares except us and our echo chamber? And your
Right.
point is, I love that you personally, as an individual professional, better be able to prove and point to exactly how you're making more than your own salary for the company.
It's not just your own salary. One of the problems is that design, this is something that Pavel Samsonov pointed out the other day. Design has seeded, which by the way, if you haven't had Pavel on your show, you have to have Pavel
I
on
know.
your
I
show.
reached out to, I'm in love with Pavel. Pavel's looking for work, by the way, folks. And if you want
Yes,
an
he is.
amazing thinker,
Yeah, someone should hire him because if he's on the street, bad things are going to happen. That you don't want that kind of brain work out there turning into
Pavel, you're going
villainy.
to have to put this at the top of your resume. Jared Spool says, I'm dangerous when left to my own devices. You should hire me immediately.
Yeah, I have a story to tell you about Pavel and his resume, but that's a whole different story. The thing is that he pointed out that design has seeded the idea of establishing what value is to the product people. And we shouldn't have done that. That was a huge mistake, right? Because UX people, particularly people who do research into who their users are, what their users need, what their current experiences are like, are ultimately the best equipped to understand what is valuable to customers and users and employees and all the people who end up using these things that we design. Because if we are doing the right research, we are actually identifying where there's missing value. And when we're able to identify that, changes everything.
So that's one of the reasons I harp so much in my own and one of the ways that we're different and the bickering at which I joke, but I'm whatever.
Other than you have better hair.
I do have better hair today, especially. It's quite good.
Yeah, it's really, yeah.
I didn't dry it.
I tried to do something with mine. It just wasn't
Yeah. So we talked
cooperating.
about you growing a mustache, but your wife then called it, what did you say she called it?
A face weasel.
Yeah, face weasel. So that pretty much put the kibosh on that. Not that there's anything wrong with that. So what I'm really interested in is like when you get down and dirty with it. Like I've been working so much with early stage startups and with innovation teams that are startups within big companies, and I think you have focused so wonderfully on what to me are bigger companies and bigger organizations and bigger structures, and leading design, which is where you took it. So if I could make that full sentence and connect A to B, it's that if we know how to design great products, we know how to do it, which I completely agree on. It's in one of my slides too. Why do we keep launching crap? And the question then becomes, it's not in our process. It's not in the way we're doing it. It's in something else. To me, it's in something bigger. It's in I call it tornadoes coming from Mount Olympus, where the executive team is battling and in like children and throwing lightning bolts down at us, which our processes cannot stand up to. No process can stand up to a tornado. You're looking at leading design, which is if you're in an organization and want to become a leader, that it's not just the person who gets great at wrangling the double diamond. It's the person who has to become powerful on Mount Olympus, whether or not they live there.
Yeah. I would phrase it as you have to become hyper valuable to Mount Olympus. You have to make sure that they don't want to make a move without you. And I wrote a piece that was intended to be a little bit tongue in cheek, but not completely, where I basically put out this radical proposal that we should put UX research in charge and have design and product and development report to UX research, because basically that's what should be driving the roadmap. It's what should be driving what gets released. It's what should be driving the definition of done, is the experiences that we should be building.
Okay, but
And
that's
that,
where I would bicker with you, because UX researchers are even less good at wrangling the politics, as far as I can tell.
sure, right? That's fine. Most chefs are bad chefs, right? We can talk about Sturgeon's law, which is basically 90% of everything is crap. So 90% of user researchers are not qualified to have this position. But I would argue that 90% of product people are also not qualified to have these conversations.
Which brings
So,
up what Mark Weeman, also people out there, is probably one of the 3 best product people I know. Getting something from a set of ideas to a product that actually works is Mark. And Mark has been talking for a while about this idea of leaving the term UX behind and rebranding as product people, which, as any product people out there, and I just talked to Bruce McCarthy, who's authored a line. Things are no better in the world of product.
yeah, they're not.
What do you think about what do you think about I totally get where he's coming from.
I think
Go
I
ahead.
think the conversation's over if we're arguing over titles. I don't care.
Yeah, but you're not
The
looking for a job.
Yeah, no, I'm not looking for a job, but positions listed, the title of job positions mean nothing, right? What does it mean to be a senior principal staff designer, comma, vice president? These are titles that don't make sense. And by the way, that's a real title from a JP Morgan Chase post. And titles are just used by HR so that they can propagate their bad habit of making sure that the salary band they place you in still pays men more than women. What matters is what we deliver as value back to our organizations. It always comes back to that. It doesn't matter what the
Yeah,
title
but
is.
if you can't get okay, but that the title is the gate in this world right now. Scads and scores of people who are great at UX and product and research and all of those things are out of work. And we can say the titles are stupid. But first we have to get in, and then we have to become powerful.
Yes, certainly you cannot change an organization from outside. So you have to be inside. But to become powerful in an organization, to have influence, to win over stakeholders, what you have to be able to do is be able to talk to how what it is you're building achieves the objectives of the organization. The title, once you're inside, the title doesn't matter. If you are propagating bullshit, you will not get very far for very long. You have to be the one who says, okay, if our objective is to increase our market share by this percentage, this is how we're going to do it. And this is how we'll do it by delivering products, services that people want to pay us for. And they want to pay us more for it because it delivers a great experience. One of the best experiments that is happening right now while we are sitting here is watching NBC Universal try to beat Disney at its A game. They are building a set of theme parks in Florida, the new Universal Epic Parks. They are investing billions of dollars, and the only advantage that they will have over Disney, it's not the technology, it's not the real estate, it's not the business model. The only advantage they will have is they will deliver a better experience than Disney. And that's the most interesting thing, right? You look at a company like Gusto. Gusto is a fascinating story because they came out of nowhere and challenged one of the largest companies in the world, ADP, on their own turf and stole customers to the point where within 5 years, they'd reached a $9 billion valuation. And the way they did that was not by somehow reinventing payroll services, but instead just offering payroll services that had a better user experience, doing the exact same things that ADP did and does, just with a better user experience. The ticket to delivering products and services in any industry that will put you in a market leadership position is to compete on experience.
But in a
It's how
world where you're
Coke
preaching to
sells
the
more
converted,
phones.
which is people listening here, which are like, yes, is experience. First of all, title does matter in that it can hurt you. So for women that I coach, taking a title that's too low can decimate their ability to do anything in an organization. But I want to talk about how you, because we have 5 minutes left and I want to make sure we get to this, how you help with the leaders of awesomeness. Because my way of understanding what you do, the way I recast it was training, helping people become so valuable that their value screams so loud, just your value screams so loud that no one can ignore it. So how do you
Right.
do that with leaders of awesomeness?
So we work on a variety of dimensions. We work on one of the gateways into being strategic. So everything we do is about being strategic versus tactical, which means putting aside the reactive, tactical, product-based thinking and focusing on, instead of reactive, being proactive, which means getting out ahead of what the organization needs instead of waiting to be asked.
Yep.
Focusing on people's experiences, not the product, right? Not thinking about how does somebody use this functionality. Ask the question, what is their day like? Who has the best day? Last week, who had the best day with your product? Who had the worst day with your product? What made the worst day for them? How did your product help them? Did it make it better, make it a better day, or make it a worse day on top of what was already going on, right? Who had a great day? Did your product help make it a better day, or did it actually reduce how good the day was, right? And why were they different? You have to be able to talk about people's experiences. UX is about improving people's lives. If we're not improving people's lives, why are we building what we're building? So everything we do should make their life better than what they had before. And yet, so many UX people cannot talk about the experiences that they are improving in people's lives.
And people are getting more powerful because of it's working, yes?
Yeah, people are leading their organizations to success. They're able to talk about challenges that nobody else in the organization knew about. We have a big focus on metrics because it turns out that executive teams like to talk in terms of metrics. People think metrics has to do with numbers. It's not numbers, it's measuring change.
Yeah.
And if we want to talk about how we are improving people's lives, we have to be able to measure the change in their lives.
Which,
and we have to show that at scale.
Yep.
And so we spend a lot of time on metrics. We spend a lot of time on strategic research, which is completely reshifting from tactical research, which is 98% of the research that is done in the world today is tactical. But we shift to strategic research where what you're focused on are people's experiences. And instead of delivering insights, you focus on building expertise. You want your entire organization to be the world's foremost experts on who your users are, what your users need, and what their current experiences are like. If your organization is not the expert in those things, you are ceding that to your competitors.
And by the way,
and
that's
they
the
will
thing they
beat
can't
your
catch
ass.
up with. If you know your users better than they do, no one can, everybody can catch up with tech. No one can catch up.
Exactly right.
Okay, so
Right.
we're down to the last minute here. I have about
Yeah.
1,012 more arguments I want to have with you, but where I want to respect the time, but I am going to beg you to come back on maybe in a month or two to continue this conversation and continue talking about this as it evolves.
Okay, I will not leave this spot until we do that.
Okay, that's good to hear. You can grow a face weasel, and
I could.
we'll expect to see that. So if any of you out there want to learn more about Leaders of Awesomeness, which you absolutely should, you should go, and we'll put the link out there. Think about joining one of the cohorts. If you put a question for Jared Spool into the comments on this podcast, I will hound him until he is sad to answer that for you, extra specially, so you can have it framed. If you'd like more information, please subscribe to Corporate Underpants. Leave a comment on Apple Podcasts, or visit me at adlininc.com to learn more about maybe being a guest or recommending a guest, or learning more about my own alignment process, Align Before Design. Jared, I love you with the passion of 1,000 suns. Thank you.
I love you second to my wife. How's that?
Oh my God, that's pretty high up there, given that you have. All right, I'll take it. I'll take it. Thank you so much, and I'll talk to you again soon.
Would be lovely. I'll be right here.
Okay. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Corporate Underpants, and there's lots more to come. If you have any projects that you need my help on, if you're interested in coaching to become a senior product leader through understanding alignment in politics, or if you're interested in any of the classes or books that I'm developing, please visit my website, adlininc.com, and get in touch.